The storm hit Larimer County on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day that had no business bringing catastrophe with it. Wade Callahan had been awake since 4 in the morning, the way he usually was, moving through the dark ranch house with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before he'd drunk half of it. He'd stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky in the west go a greenish color that no rancher ever wanted to see, and by 6 o'clock the wind had come down off the high plains, like something with a grudge against the land itself. By the time it was over, 3 fence lines were down. The old hay barn had lost its entire east wall, and the guest cabin at the north end of the property, a sturdy little building his father had put up in 1962, had a pine tree sitting through the middle of it like God had planted it there on purpose. Wade stood in the mud in the aftermath and looked at the cabin for a long time without saying anything. There was nobody to say anything to. There hadn't been for 3 years, not since his foreman Hector had retired and moved back to New Mexico to be close to his grandchildren, and not since the property had quietly shrunk from a working cattle operation into something that was mostly Wade and the land and the particular kind of silence that fills up big spaces when people leave them. He was 41 years old, and he was not a man who spent much time feeling sorry for himself, but he stood in the wet grass that morning and acknowledged, privately and without ceremony, that he could not fix the cabin alone. He didn't have the time, and he didn't have the hands. What he had was about 400 head of cattle that needed tending, a truck with a transmission that was threatening to give out, and a body that had been complaining about the cold since February in ways it never used to. He drove into Harlan's Creek that afternoon and put a card up on the bulletin board outside the feed store. Repair work. Guest cabin restoration. Fair wages. Flexible hours. See Callahan at the Running Sea North Fork Road. He didn't expect much. Harlan's Creek was not a big town. Quote, she came 3 days later, just after sunrise. Wade was in the paddock working with a young gelding that had picked up a bad habit of shying at nothing, and he didn't hear the truck until it was already in the yard. A rusted-out Chevy that sounded like it was running on stubbornness alone. The kind of vehicle that made a man wince just listening to the engine. He watched it from over the fence as it pulled up and went quiet with a shudder. The woman who got out was not what he'd been expecting, though he couldn't have said precisely what he had been expecting. She was somewhere in her early 30s, medium height, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had mostly come undone. She was wearing work pants that had seen better days and a canvas jacket with a tear along one shoulder that had been stitched back together with the kind of rough functional repair that said she'd done it herself and hadn't thought much about it. She was not a small woman, broad-shouldered and solid, built like someone who had been doing hard physical labor for a long time. And she carried herself with a kind of careful stillness, like she was always measuring the distance between herself and every exit. She saw him watching her from the paddock and didn't flinch, just walked to the fence and waited. "You're Callahan," she said. "I am. I'm here about the cabin work." She said it plainly, no preamble. "I do carpentry, framing, roofing, finish work. I also do dry masonry if the foundation needs it." Wade let himself out of the paddock and came toward her, and she held her ground the way some people do when they've trained themselves not to step back. He noticed that. He also noticed the shadows under her eyes, which were not the shadows of a bad night's sleep, but something older and more structural than that, like they'd been living in her face long enough to become part of the architecture. "You got references?" he said. "I've got work experience. Spent 2 years doing restoration on the Hendricks property outside of Denton. Before that, I worked construction framing in Wyoming." She paused. "I don't have paper references, but I can show you what I can do before you decide." It was an honest answer. Wade respected honest answers more than polished ones. The cabin took a pine tree through the roof. North and east walls need rebuilding from the foundation up on the east side. Roofing's a total loss, probably 3 months of work if you move steady. "I can move steady," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You got a name?" "Eliza Hart." "Where are you staying, Miss Hart?" Something shifted in her face. Not much, just a brief tightening around the eyes, gone almost before it appeared. "I've got a place," she said. "It's not close, but I'll be here on time." He didn't push. He named a wage that was fair by county standards, and she accepted it without negotiating, which told him something. A person who didn't try to negotiate when a wage was offered was either satisfied with what they'd been given or too desperate to risk losing the job. Looking at her, he couldn't be certain which one applied. "Start Monday," he said. "I'll start tomorrow," she said. "If that's all right." He nodded. She went back to her truck, and he watched her drive out down the North Fork Road, and then he went back to the gelding and thought about her careful eyes and the way she'd stood like someone who expected the ground to shift under her feet at any moment. She was there the next morning when he came out at 5:30, standing at the cabin with a flashlight, already assessing the damage before the sun was up. He brought her coffee without asking, and she took it with a nod that wasn't quite a thank you, but wasn't nothing either. They stood together for a few minutes in the early dark while she walked the flashlight beam along the east wall. "Foundation's sound on the north side," she said. "East corner's shifted about 1.5 inches. I'll need to re-level before I frame anything new, otherwise the whole wall will be fighting itself in 5 years. She crouched down and put her hand on the concrete, pressing her fingers along the crack line the way someone reads a page. "Whoever poured this did good work. It's just the weight of the tree over time." "My father built it," Wade said. She looked up at him briefly. He knew what he was doing. It was a simple thing to say, but it landed somewhere it wasn't expected to. Wade took a sip of his coffee. "What do you need first?" he said. She had a list already, not written down. She recited it from memory, lumber dimensions and hardware specifications and a particular kind of roofing nailer she preferred. He took notes on the back of an envelope from his jacket pocket, and by the time the sun was fully up, she was already working, pulling the damaged wall framing apart with a methodical efficiency that made him feel, obscurely, like he was watching someone who had learned not to waste anything. Not motion, not energy, not time. Das. By the end of the first week, Wade had cataloged a list of things about Eliza Hart that didn't add up. Not individually, but as a collection. She never ate lunch on the property. He'd offered twice, the first time directly, and the second time by simply leaving food out on the tailgate of his truck with no comment, and she'd ignored it both times. She drank water, she kept working, and around noon she'd disappear into her truck for about 20 minutes and come back looking like she'd been doing something other than resting. She flinched at sudden loud sounds. Not dramatically. She didn't drop tools or cry out. But if Wade came around a corner without warning, or if something fell with a bang in the barn, he'd see her go still for just a moment, her body gathering itself in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with something older. It was a flinch that knew it was happening and tried to suppress itself, which was, in his experience, a very different thing from an ordinary startle. She left every day before dark without exception. It didn't matter where she was in a task. She would stop, organize her tools, cover any exposed work with a tarp, and go. Not rushed, but absolute. Like the rule existed before everything else. And she kept her truck pointed out. Every day when she parked, she'd swing it around so the nose was facing the road. The first time he noticed it, he'd thought it was habit, or maybe just consideration. By the fourth day, he understood it was neither. He didn't ask her about any of it. He'd grown up in a county where people had reasons for things, and those reasons were their own. And he'd lived long enough to know that the people most worth knowing were usually carrying something they hadn't been offered a safe place to set down. He wasn't sure yet if he was a safe place for anything. He just watched, and he thought about what he was watching, and he kept bringing 2 cups of coffee out in the morning because she never said no to the coffee. "You do all this work yourself?" Eliza asked one afternoon, somewhere in the second week. She was up on the roof frame, fitting new rafters, and Wade was handing material up to her. She wasn't looking at him. She was sighting along a rafter to check its angle, but the question seemed genuine. "Most of it," he said. "Had a foreman for a long time. He retired." "You run cattle alone?" "More or less." She set the rafter in place and reached down for the nailer. "That's a lot of ground for one person." "It is," he said. He handed her a handful of joist hangers. "How long have you been doing this kind of work, construction?" She was quiet for a moment, fitting the hardware. "Long enough," she said. "My father did it. I used to follow him around job sites when I was little." A pause. "He wasn't exactly trying to teach me. I just paid attention anyway." "Sounds like a good way to learn." "It's the only way that stuck," she said. "Everything else somebody tried to teach me, I forgot half of it. Things I figured out myself, I kept." Wade thought about that. "You have family around here?" The hammer stopped moving. just for a second, and then it started again. "No," she said. "No family." He let it go. But he carried it with him the rest of the afternoon, the way she'd said "no family" with a flatness that was not the flatness of someone telling a simple fact. It was the flatness of someone who had decided to tell half the truth because the whole truth was not on offer. Intik. The third week of October, she showed up with her left hand wrapped in a cloth that was not a proper bandage, tied too tight around the knuckles and already showing a rust-colored stain at the palm. She tried to unwrap it and rewrap it quietly before he got close enough to see, but he was already close. "What happened?" he said. "Cut it on a nail," she said. "It's fine." "That's not fine. That needs cleaning at least." "I said it's fine, Mr. Callahan." Her voice had an edge in it he hadn't heard before. Not angry exactly, but warning. Don't push this. Don't make this into something. He recognized the tone. He'd heard it from animals that were hurt but not willing to be handled. Not because they were mean, but because trusting someone with a wound required a particular kind of confidence in the outcome that they hadn't yet developed. He went to the house and came back with a first aid kit and set it on the tailgate without saying anything and went back to what he'd been doing. He didn't look at her. 10 minutes later, he heard her moving around near the truck, and when he came back, the cloth was gone and the hand was properly cleaned and wrapped with the bandage tape from the kit. She put the kit on the porch without a word. He nodded. They went back to work. That was the day, he thought later, that something shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way either of them probably could have named in the moment. But he'd left the door open, so to speak, and she'd walked through it just far enough to take what she needed without asking, and neither of them had made anything of it, and that had meant something. He followed her on a Thursday evening, and he was not proud of it. He'd tried to rationalize it several ways before he did it. He told himself he was concerned about a safety issue. The hand had been one thing, but he'd noticed the way she looked sometimes at the end of the day, a specific kind of depletion that was about more than hard work. He told himself he was just driving the fence line, which happened to go north. He told himself he wasn't really following her. None of that was true. He was following her because she'd told him she had a place, but he'd been delivering her paycheck in cash every Friday, and she always took it immediately, and once he'd noticed her counting it in her truck before she drove away, and it was not the behavior of someone who had a secure situation waiting for them. It was the behavior of someone for whom every dollar was the difference between one thing and another. He kept his distance, headlights off as long as he could manage, and he watched her turn off the North Fork onto a fire road that went up into the lower hills, a track that he knew but didn't use regularly because it led to nothing of his, just old grazing land that had gone back to scrub brush and pine over the years. She went about 2 miles up that road and stopped, and he pulled over and killed the engine and watched from the tree line. The shack was something he'd known was up there in the vague way a man knows about features of his landscape. He'd have said it was an old line camp, probably abandoned for decades. But there was a light in it, a small, steady light, the kind of light a lantern makes. And there was smoke coming from the stovepipe. And then he saw the children. There were 4 of them. They came out of the shack when her truck pulled up. 2 boys and 2 girls, as near as he could tell in the dimness, ranging in age from maybe 4 to 10 or 11. They came out the way children come when they've been waiting a long time and the waiting is over, all at once and immediately, surrounding her as she got out of the truck, grabbing her hands and her jacket and talking over each other. She was different with them. Even from where Wade sat in the dark, he could see it. The careful stillness she maintained throughout her days on his ranch was gone, replaced by something unguarded and immediate, her whole body reorienting toward them. She crouched down to the youngest one and picked the child up, and the child wrapped both arms around her neck, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and her face pressed against the child's hair. Wade sat in the dark for a long time after that. He didn't move for a while. He was thinking about the way she'd said no family, with that flat, careful voice, and about the lunch breaks she never took on his property, and about the cash she counted in the truck, and about the hand she'd hurt that she'd been willing to let go unclean rather than ask him for anything. He was thinking about 4 children in a line camp shack in the hills going into November, which in this part of Colorado was not a month that forgave inadequate shelter. He drove back to the ranch and sat in the kitchen for an hour with his cold coffee and did not come up with anything that felt adequate to what he'd seen. The next morning he raised her pay. He didn't make an event of it. He came out to the cabin where she was already working and said, "I've been thinking. The scope of this job is bigger than I wrote on that card. I should have been paying you more from the start, going to correct that going forward." He named a figure that was substantially higher than what he'd been paying, and he watched her face. She went still. That careful, measuring stillness. "That's not necessary," she said. "It's fair," he said, which is different from necessary. She looked at him for a moment with something in her eyes that he couldn't read clearly. Wariness and something else underneath it, a question she was clearly deciding whether to ask. She didn't ask it. She nodded once and turned back to the work. He also moved her hours. Without making it about anything, he told her he'd been thinking about the workflow on the property and asked if she'd be able to come in earlier and take a longer midday break. He needed someone to run a couple of the horses around noon, and it might as well be an official break with pay rather than an informal arrangement. The midday break would give her enough time to drive up to the shack and feed the children lunch. She didn't say anything about that. She accepted the schedule change the same way she'd accepted the first aid kit, quietly, without making it into anything, taking what was offered without turning it into a debt she had to acknowledge. He respected that about her more than he could have explained. By November, the east wall was fully rebuilt, straight and solid, and the roof framing was done. Eliza had developed an instinct for the work that went beyond competence. She made decisions without being asked, adapted when materials weren't quite right, solved problems with the kind of casual ingenuity that you couldn't teach in a classroom. Watching her work was satisfying in a way that watching good work always was. The pleasure of seeing someone do something at the level where it stopped being effort and became something closer to expression. They'd developed a rhythm together. Not a friendship exactly. She was too guarded for what most people would call friendship, and he was not a man who pushed into spaces he wasn't invited into. But it was something. A shared language of the work, a mutual recognition of a standard. She had strong opinions about structural decisions, and she'd started voicing them without waiting to be asked, which he took as a good sign. She was right more often than not, and when she wasn't, she accepted his reasoning without making it a fight. They talked more than they used to. Not about anything large. About the cattle, about the property, about the old materials from his father's era that they kept finding as they dismantled damaged sections. She was curious about the ranch's history in a way that seemed genuine rather than polite. She asked about his father, who had built the cabin. She asked about the land, how it had changed, how he'd come to run it alone. He told her some of it, not all of it. He was not a man who laid himself out all at once for anyone, and she wasn't the type to push for it. They were, he thought, a similar kind of people in certain ways that neither of them had articulated and probably wouldn't. One afternoon, she was mixing mortar for the chimney repair, and she said, without looking up, "You ever regret staying here? When you could have gone somewhere else?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Not the staying. Sometimes I regret the ways I did it, the things I did and didn't do while I was here." He picked up a trowel. "You thinking about staying somewhere?" A long pause. The mortar scraped against the bucket. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," she said. He didn't push that either, but he thought about it. He thought about what it meant to be a person who was thinking about staying somewhere when everything in your daily behavior said you were still prepared to run at any moment. He thought about what that gap cost. Yes, the middle of November brought the first real cold, not the pleasant crispness of early fall, but the hard, bone-finding cold that came down off the high peaks and found every crack in every structure and every piece of clothing that wasn't adequate. Wade started noticing things about Eliza that he'd pushed to the edge of his awareness and could no longer leave there. She was losing weight, not dramatically. She was a sturdy woman with reserves, but her face had gone sharper over the weeks, the kind of sharpness that comes from not eating enough. And he'd noticed the way she ate lunch on the property now, during the break he'd built into her schedule, before she drove up to the shack. She ate quickly and steadily, like someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. He did some rough calculations one evening. 4 children, ages ranging from 4 to maybe 11. A structure in the hills that was not weatherproofed, not properly heated, that had been a line camp and not a dwelling for decades. November going into December in a Colorado county where the temperature could drop to single digits and stay there for weeks. He did not sleep well that night. The next morning, he came out to the cabin before she arrived, and he sat on the steps and looked at the mountains and thought about how to offer a thing to a person who had made it entirely clear in every interaction that she was not going to accept anything that looked like charity. He thought about it for a long time. When she pulled in and came across the yard, he said, without preamble, "I'm going to winterize the old bunkhouse next to the barn. It's a 3-room structure, solid, with working heat. I need someone to stay on site through the winter for the cattle. Early morning checks, emergency response if something goes wrong in a storm. I can't do it all alone anymore." He paused. "The arrangement would include the bunkhouse at no cost in exchange for the additional responsibility. It comes with a kitchen." He watched her face. She looked at him for a long moment, that careful measuring look. Then she looked at the bunkhouse, then back at him. "How many people?" she said. Her voice was carefully flat. "You'd know better than me," he said. "Whatever you need." Another long silence. He did not look away from her, and he did not look at her too hard. He held his own face still and waited. "I have children," she said. It came out like a thing that had been held under pressure for a long time. "4, they're mine." Her jaw set. "I know how that sounds. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not looking for—" "Ms. Hart," he said. She stopped. "I know," he said simply. "The bunkhouse has 3 bedrooms. The kitchen has a propane stove, and I had the pipes checked last spring. The heat works." He stood up. "I'll start on it today if you can tell me what it needs." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, something that might have been on its way to gratitude but had taken a hard left before it got there, and ended up closer to suspicion, or maybe both at once. Her eyes were bright in a way that she clearly wasn't planning on them being, and she looked away from him quickly toward the cabin. "The porch boards on the bunkhouse are soft," she said, her voice steady. "I noticed it when I walked past. I'll check the substructure before I put any weight on them." "All right," he said. She walked toward the bunkhouse without another word, and he let out a breath he hadn't entirely known he was holding and went to get the coffee. Moving day was the last Saturday of November. She did it without warning, without announcement. He came out in the morning, and her truck was loaded with things he'd never seen before: bedding, a cardboard box that clinked with what sounded like dishes, several garbage bags tied at the top, and a small green bicycle with training wheels still on it. And the children. This was the first time he'd seen them in daylight, and they were all clearly Eliza's. They had her eyes, or her bone structure, or her way of going quiet and watchful when something was new. The oldest, a girl of about 11 with her hair in 2 braids, stood to the side of the group with her arms crossed, and her expression one of measured skepticism, which Wade found instantly comprehensible. The second was a boy of about 9 who immediately and without social preamble walked to the paddock fence to look at the horses. There were 2 younger ones, a girl of 6 or 7 who stuck close to Eliza's side, and the smallest, a boy who Wade estimated at about 4, who had transferred his scrutiny entirely to Wade and was staring at him with the frank and unself-conscious appraisal that only very young children can manage without it being rude. "These your cows?" the small boy said. "They are," Wade said. "They're very big." "They are that." "My name is Cooper," the boy announced. "Wade Callahan," Wade said, and shook the child's offered hand with the gravity it deserved. Eliza was watching this exchange with an expression he couldn't categorize. He didn't look at her long enough to analyze it. The oldest girl's name was Nora. The 9-year-old at the fence was Miles. The 6-year-old by Eliza's side was Josie, who said nothing and watched everything with wide, careful eyes. Cooper, 4 years old, had apparently already decided Wade was acceptable because he immediately began following him around the yard, asking questions about the cattle, the barn, the dog Wade didn't have, but that Cooper seemed to think was implied by the existence of a ranch. The bunkhouse was ready. He'd spent the better part of a week on it. New weather stripping, the porch boards replaced, the propane heater serviced, the windows resealed. He'd put extra blankets in the bedroom closets, and he'd stocked the kitchen with basics without making it a production, just groceries, the kind of things that were practical. He hadn't put a bow on it. He'd just made it livable. Eliza walked through it without speaking, touching the windowsills, checking the heat vent, opening the kitchen cabinets. He stood in the doorway and didn't follow her in. Cooper had latched onto his leg by this point and was attempting to climb it like a tree, which Wade managed with the solemn dignity the situation seemed to call for. When she came back to the doorway, She looked at him steadily for a moment, and he saw the war going on inside her between the part that needed this and the part that had taught herself, probably over years of hard practice, never to need anything from anyone. "Thank you," she said. And it was the plainest, most unadorned thank you he had ever heard, with no performance in it at all, nothing added to make it seem smaller than it was. "It's a fair exchange," he said. "You're on site now." "Right," she said. Not agreeing exactly, but not fighting it either. Josie appeared at her mother's elbow and looked at Wade with the same careful eyes as her mother. "Do you have a dog?" Josie asked. "I don't," Wade said. "I've been thinking about it." Josie considered this information with great seriousness, and then she went back inside and Eliza looked at her daughters retreating back with an expression that was exhausted and fiercely protective, and something else entirely, something that he thought might be the beginnings of relief, though she would probably not have called it that. She went back inside to start unpacking, and Wade detached Cooper from his leg, and the dog question would come up again many times in the weeks ahead. And outside the bunkhouse windows, the Colorado sky was the flat blue of late November, and the cattle in the far pasture moved slowly through the dry grass, and the running sea was, for the first time in a long time, something other than quiet. December came in hard and stayed that way. The first real blizzard hit the second week of the month, dropping 18 inches of snow across Larimer County in 36 hours, and sealing the roads long enough that Wade didn't get to town for 4 days. He'd been through enough Colorado winters that this didn't trouble him much. The pantry was stocked, the hay was in, the cattle had shelter. What did trouble him, in the way that things trouble a man who has spent years not being troubled by much, was the bunkhouse light that stayed on past midnight, 2 nights running, during the worst of the storm. He didn't go over and knock. It wasn't his business what hours she kept, but he watched the light from his kitchen window while the snow came down, and he thought about it. The morning after the storm broke, he found Eliza already outside at 5:45, digging out the path between the bunkhouse and the barn with a grain shovel. She'd done about 30 feet of it before he got there, moving with that steady, relentless efficiency he'd come to recognize as simply how she existed in the world. "Storm kept you up?" he said, picking up the second shovel leaning against the barn wall. "Cooper gets scared in thunder," she said, not offering it exactly, just answering what he'd asked. "He's fine once it passes." "4-year-olds don't have much use for weather logic," Wade said. She made a short sound that might have been agreement. They shoveled for a while in the gray morning, their breath coming in clouds. The cattle were moving in the far pasture, dark shapes against the white. "Nora was up too," Eliza said after a while. "She doesn't show it the same way Cooper does. She just goes quiet and sits by the window." She stopped shoveling for a moment and looked at the snow still sitting heavy on the bunkhouse roof. "She's been through too many nights in bad weather in places that weren't adequate." She didn't elaborate. She went back to shoveling. Wade didn't push it, but the image lodged in him. A child sitting quiet by a window in a lined camp shack while a blizzard came down, holding herself together because she was too old to be afraid the way her little brother was afraid. "The bunkhouse roof is solid," he said. "I had it checked in September." "I know," she said. "She knows too. It's just, some things take time before the body believes them." He thought about that for the rest of the morning. The children changed the ranch in ways Wade hadn't anticipated, which was mainly because he hadn't let himself anticipate anything. He'd made the offer about the bunkhouse with a practical logic he'd constructed carefully enough that he almost believed it himself, and once they'd arrived, he'd gone back to his own routines and told himself the arrangement was simply professional. That position became harder to maintain around the 3rd week of December. Miles, the 9-year-old, had developed a quiet obsession with the horses that Wade recognized immediately, because he'd had the same obsession at the same age. The boy would appear at the paddock fence every morning before school, as reliably as sunrise, standing on the bottom rail with his chin on the top one, watching the animals with an absorption that required nothing back from them. Wade started timing his morning check to coincide with this, and they'd stand together at the fence for 10 or 15 minutes without necessarily talking, which was a companionable way to start a day. One morning, Wade asked if he wanted to come inside the paddock, and Miles looked at him with his mother's careful eyes. "I don't know how," the boy said. "That's what learning's for," Wade said. He kept it simple. Stand still, let the horse come to you, don't reach for them before they're ready. Miles absorbed it with an intense, quiet attention that was almost unnerving in a child. and the young bay mare that had been Wade's most skeptical horse walked over and put her nose on the boy's shoulder within 5 minutes, which surprised even Wade. "She likes me," Miles said. "She does," Wade said. "She doesn't do that with most people." Miles looked at the mare with an expression that Wade couldn't name exactly, but that lived somewhere in the vicinity of the way a person looks when they've been told for a long time that they're not worth much, and then something with honest instincts disagrees. He didn't mention it to Eliza. He filed it away. Nora, the eldest, kept her distance from Wade for the better part of 3 weeks. She was polite in the way that children are polite when they've been taught that courtesy is a form of protection, saying please and thank you and yes, sir, without ever quite looking at him directly. She helped her mother in the mornings before school, and she looked after the younger two in the afternoons with a competence that was both impressive and faintly sad. She was 11 years old, and she moved through the world like someone who expected to be responsible for things. Wade didn't push. He left her alone and let her observe him from whatever distance she needed, and he behaved consistently day after day and did not make any moves toward warmth that she hadn't indicated she wanted. Josie was the unpredictable one. She'd decided at some point in the first week that Wade was acceptable, and she expressed this determination not through warmth exactly, but through a habit of appearing wherever he was working and doing her own separate project nearby. She never asked to help. She just showed up with something to do. A drawing, a collection of rocks she was sorting by some system of her own invention, a book she read slowly and apparently at random, and worked on it in his vicinity. He found it oddly comfortable. Cooper remained his most enthusiastic audience. The dog question had evolved into a broader interest in ranch animals of all kinds, and Wade had started answering his questions with the seriousness they deserved, which Cooper seemed to find deeply satisfying. What he was less prepared for was Eliza herself, not in a way he'd have known how to explain to anyone had there been anyone to explain it to. It was more that the version of her that existed during working hours, careful, contained, giving nothing she hadn't measured first, was not the only version that existed, and living in adjacent structures meant that occasionally he caught glimpses of the others. He heard her laugh once, through the bunkhouse kitchen window on a Sunday morning. Not the controlled brief sound she occasionally made when something struck her as genuinely absurd, but a real laugh, the kind that comes out before you decide to let it. He didn't know what had prompted it, probably something Cooper had done, Cooper being reliably ridiculous, but he heard it from the yard and he stopped what he was doing for just a moment and then made himself continue. He noticed that she read. She was always either working or with the children or apparently sleeping, but in the brief intervals between those states, she had a book. Different ones. Nothing he'd have predicted. A history of water rights in the American West. A thick novel whose title he'd glimpsed once but couldn't read from a distance. A field guide to native grasses that she'd clearly borrowed from his own shelf in the barn without asking, which he chose to take as a sign of comfort. She returned it 3 days later with a leaf tucked in as a bookmark, and 2 of the pages dog-eared, and he looked at which pages she'd marked and found that she'd chosen the same sections he always came back to. He did not think about what that meant for very long. What he let himself think about instead was the more practical problem, which was that December was more than halfway gone, and Christmas was coming, and he had 4 children on his property who were, as near as he could tell, unaware that any particular preparation was expected. Eliza had said nothing about it. The children said nothing about it. The bunkhouse showed no signs of tree or decoration or any of the other markers of the season. He drove to the hardware store in Harlan's Creek on the 20th and bought a tree stand. He'd had a tree at the ranch every year, mostly for himself, which was a thing he'd never acknowledged as the slightly mournful habit it was. He cut a good-sized pine from the south pasture and set it up in the corner of the living room and put the box of ornaments down without opening it. He was standing there looking at it when the knock came at the front door, which nobody ever used. He opened it and found Josie, who had apparently tracked down the front door the way she tracked down wherever he was. "You have a tree," she said, looking past him. "I do." She looked at it for a long moment. "We don't have one." "I know," he said. "I was thinking, if your mother doesn't mind, maybe you could all help me with mine." She looked at him with her considering eyes. "Do you know how to do it?" "I've done it a few times," he said, "but I've been doing it alone. Could probably use some expert advice." She appeared to find this reasonable. She went back to the bunkhouse and 20 minutes later she returned with Miles and Cooper and, trailing a little behind, Eliza, who was carrying the sleeping 4-year-old and wearing an expression that told him she'd been informed of the situation and had not entirely decided how to feel about it. She stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the undecorated tree. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I do it every year," he said. "Couldn't reach the top." She looked at him. They both knew the ceiling was not especially high. "Well," she said, setting Cooper down, who immediately woke up and launched toward the ornament box with the certainty of someone who has been waiting for this his whole life. It was not a smooth or organized decorating session. Cooper wanted every ornament in a cluster at his eye level. Miles had a strong and well-argued opinion about the placement of the lights that conflicted with Josie's equally strong but differently reasoned opinion. Nora, unexpectedly, turned out to have definite aesthetic preferences about these things, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she spoke to Wade directly and at length about symmetry and color distribution and the proper ratio of tinsel to ornament, with the authority of someone who has been thinking about this for years and has finally found a context where her knowledge is relevant. "You can't put the big ones at the top," she told him. "They're too heavy. They'll pull the branches down." "Hadn't thought of that," he said. "Most people don't," she said, with the patient diplomacy of someone who has had to explain this before. She held out her hand for the ornament he was holding. He gave it to her and watched her place it with precise and deliberate care on a branch at exactly the right height. And something in her posture was different, just slightly, just enough to notice, from the careful, protected posture she'd worn every day since November. Eliza, from across the room, was watching her daughter with an expression that she'd turned slightly away so Wade wouldn't see. He saw it anyway. He looked at the tree. January brought a different kind of difficult. The cattle work was relentless in the worst weeks of winter. Hay delivery, water tank maintenance, checking for signs of illness, the constant vigilance of keeping a herd healthy through the season. Eliza had folded into the work of the ranch in a way that had gone beyond the original cabin job without either of them formally acknowledging it. She was up before dawn and she knew what needed doing, and she did it without being directed. And Wade had stopped thinking of himself as managing the property alone, which was a cognitive shift he had not made a conscious decision about. What he had made a conscious decision about was the matter of the children's schooling. The drive from the Running Sea to the Harlan's Creek Elementary School was 37 minutes on a good road day. In winter, it was longer and occasionally impossible. In the first 3 weeks of January, Eliza had driven it every morning before coming back to work, which meant she was adding over an hour to her day each way when the roads were bad. And Wade had noticed that she drove it in a truck whose front left tire he had serious reservations about. He bought a set of winter tires for her truck and had them mounted at the shop in town. He left the receipt on the kitchen table in the bunkhouse with a note that said, "Road conditions, operational necessity, not charity." She knocked on his door that evening. He'd been expecting her. "This is too much," she said. "It's $340, he said. "I know what it is." "Eliza." He said her first name for the first time, and it stopped both of them for a moment. He pushed through it. That tire was going to fail on a mountain road in the next freeze, with the children in the truck. She stood in his doorway and said nothing, and her jaw was set in the way it got when she was fighting against something inside herself. "I'll deduct it from wages," she said finally. "You'll do nothing of the kind," he said. Another silence, then, "You can't just—" She stopped, started again. "People don't just do things like this, not without wanting something back." He met her eyes. "What is it you think I want?" She looked at him for a long moment, and the calculation in that look was not comfortable to be the subject of. It was the look of someone who had been wrong before, about what people wanted, and had paid the price of that wrongness over a long period of time. He held still and let her look. "I don't know yet," she said. It was honest. It was probably the most honest thing she could have said. "All right," he said. "When you figure it out, tell me if I'm doing it." She held his gaze for another beat, and then she went back across the yard, and he stood at the door and watched the light come on in the bunkhouse kitchen. And he was not sure what he'd just said or whether it had been the right thing to say, but it had been the true thing, which was sometimes the best he could do. "Ba?" It was Miles who started it, though Miles didn't know he was starting anything. One afternoon in late January, the boy came back from school and went directly to the paddock, as he usually did, and Wade was already there working with one of the older horses on a ground manners issue. Miles climbed the fence and watched for a while, and then he said without preamble, "Tommy Atterbury says we're squatters." Wade kept his attention on the horse. "Tommy Atterbury know what that word means?" "He says it means we live on your land without paying and you can make us leave whenever you want." "Tommy Atterbury is 9 years old and a considerable distance from being an authority on property law," Wade said. Miles was quiet for a moment. "Are we squatters?" Wade stopped working with the horse and looked at the boy directly. "Your mother works on this ranch. The bunkhouse is part of her compensation for that work. That's a formal employment arrangement, and it has nothing to do with charity or squatting." He paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," Miles said. "But does my mom know that's what it is?" It was the kind of question that a 9-year-old could ask, because they hadn't yet learned that some questions exposed too much of the room. Wade absorbed it. "Your mom and I understand each other," he said. "You don't need to worry about it." Miles looked at him with his careful eyes. Then he climbed down from the fence on the inside and stood next to Wade and the horse. "Can I try the lead?" he said. "Take it slow," Wade said, and handed it over. But he thought about what Miles had asked for the rest of the evening. Does my mom know that's what it is? He thought about the fact that Eliza had spent months constructing elaborate mental frameworks to justify accepting every piece of help he offered, running each one through some internal accounting system that tracked what things cost and what they meant and what could eventually be asked in return. He thought about how exhausting that must be. He thought about how a person got to a place where every good thing that happened to them was something they needed to interpret for danger before they could feel it. He didn't know the whole story. He knew pieces. A violent man somewhere in her past. That much was clear from the way she moved and what she flinched at. 4 children that she'd apparently removed from that situation and gone into hiding to protect. No family, no support structure, nothing but her own labor standing between them and whatever they'd been running from. What he didn't know was whether they were still running or whether whatever they'd run from was still looking. For some moments. He found out on the 1st of February. It was a Tuesday, and Eliza hadn't come to work. This had never happened. In 4 months, she had been present every morning without exception, often before him. He went to the bunkhouse and knocked, and Nora answered the door with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite making it. "Mom's not feeling well," Nora said. "Is she sick?" Nora's eyes went somewhere to the side of his face. "She's just not feeling well." He came in, which he'd never done before, and found the younger children in the living room with a stillness that was nothing like their ordinary stillness. The particular silence of children who have been told to be quiet and are being quiet with everything they have. Josie had Cooper's hand. Miles was sitting with his arms crossed, looking at the floor. "Nora," Wade said quietly. "What happened?" The girl looked at him and the composure slipped. Not all the way, she caught it, but it slipped enough to see what was under it. "There was a letter," she said, "under the windshield wiper of Mom's truck last night." She swallowed. "We don't know how it got there. We were all inside." He found Eliza in this kitchen, sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. She was not crying. She had the face of someone who had stopped crying a while ago and had gone somewhere beyond it, into a kind of flat, suspended state. The letter was on the table in front of her. He could see the edge of it. She didn't offer it to him, and he didn't reach for it, but he could see a line of handwriting at the top of the page from where he stood. "I know where you are. How long has he known?" Wade said. She looked up at him. Not surprised that he knew who he was. Maybe not capable of being surprised by anything at the moment. "I don't know," she said. "The letter says he's been watching for a while." Her voice was even, with the terrible evenness of someone who is holding something together through sheer act of will. "He's not here yet. He does this. He lets you know first, so you can think about it." "Who is he?" "Derek Vaughn." She said the name the way you say the name of a thing you have spent years trying not to say. "He's my husband. Estranged. We left him 18 months ago." She looked down at the mug. "I thought we were far enough away." Wade pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Tell me what I need to know," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. That look, the calculation and the caution and the thing underneath both of those. And then she told him. Not everything, not in order, but enough. A marriage that had started like most bad things start, not badly, and then had become something else gradually, and then all at once. A man who controlled everything: money, movement, her time, her sleep, what she wore, and who she talked to and what she said. The escalations over the years. The children learning early to read a room the way children in those situations do, building internal calibration systems for a man's moods. The night she'd left. She didn't go into detail about what had made that night the one, but her voice changed slightly when she approached it and changed back after, and Wade didn't need the details to understand the shape of it. She'd taken the children and the truck and $200, and she'd driven north until the money was almost gone, and then she'd found work where she could and moved twice when she thought she might have been found, and ended up in Larimer County because the job listing at the feed store had said the work was remote. "He won't come quietly," she said. "He'll come with lawyers first. He'll talk to people in town, make a case. He knows how to appear reasonable to people who don't know him." She pushed the mug to the side. "He'll go after the children, custody. It's how he operates. Not because he wants them, but because it's what he can use." "He hurt them?" Wade said. Her jaw tightened. "Not the way you mean, not directly, but children see everything, and they feel everything, and what he did to their mother, they felt." She looked at the table. "That's enough. That's more than enough." Wade sat with that for a moment. "Do you have documentation?" he said. "Anything. Medical records, police reports, anything that goes on record?" "Some," she said. "From before I left, not as much as I should have." "You'll need a lawyer." "I can't afford a lawyer." "We'll figure that out," he said. She looked at him sharply. "Wade." "What?" "I don't need you to fix this," she said. "I need—" She stopped, pressed her fingers to her forehead. "I have been handling things alone for a long time. I know how to do that." "You have been surviving alone," he said. "That's different." The words came out before he'd fully weighed them, and he saw them land. She went still in a way that was not the careful stillness she wore as armor. It was different, softer, like something underneath had shifted unexpectedly. "That's not fair," she said, but without heat. "No," he said, "it isn't." They sat across from each other in the winter kitchen, and outside the window the Colorado light was flat and white, and the ranch was very quiet. "He's going to come here," she said. Not a question. "Probably," Wade said. "This is your property. Your life. This isn't—" She stopped again. "Eliza." He waited until she looked at him. "Whatever's coming, it's not coming at just you anymore. That's the thing I need you to understand." He paused. "You've been the only one standing in front of your family for a long time. You don't have to be the only one." She looked at him for a long time, and he could see the internal struggle as clearly as if it were printed across her face, the part of her that wanted to believe him, and the part that had been lied to before, and the part that was simply too tired to hold every wall up all the time. She didn't say anything. She looked down at the letter on the table. "I need to talk to Nora," she said finally. "She's old enough. She's been carrying this with me, and she deserves to know what's happening." "She's tough," Wade said. "Too tough for 11, Eliza said. "That's not a compliment. That's the thing I'm most sorry about." She pushed back from the table and stood up, and the version of her that walked into the living room was not the same one who'd been sitting in the kitchen a minute before. She'd put herself together, not by hiding what had happened, but by deciding that what was in front of her mattered more than what she was feeling. He watched her go and thought about what she'd said about surviving versus living, and about the difference between the two things, and about how long it sometimes takes before a person can tell them apart. He sat at her kitchen table for a few minutes after she left, looking at the letter. Then he took out his phone and called the one lawyer he knew in the county, a man named Greer, who handled property disputes and the occasional ugly divorce, and left him a message asking him to call back as soon as possible. Outside, the wind had picked up and the bare cottonwood branches by the fence were moving hard against the gray sky, and somewhere in the pasture the cattle were moving to the windward side of the shelter, doing what animals do when they feel the weather about to change. Greer called back the next morning. He was a compact, precise man in his early 60s who had practiced family law in Larimer County for longer than Wade had been alive, and he had the particular manner of someone who had heard a great many difficult stories and had learned how to listen to them without letting his face do anything unhelpful. He came out to the ranch on a Thursday, driving a sensible sedan that looked wrong parked in the yard between Wade's truck and Eliza's, and he sat at Wade's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee, and he listened while Eliza talked. She was not, Wade noticed, the same woman who had sat frozen at her own kitchen table 2 days earlier. She had done something in the interval, sorted through what had happened, organized it, decided what it meant, and what she was going to do about it. She sat across from Greer with her hands flat on the table, and she told the story in order, with dates where she had them, and honest acknowledgement where she didn't. And she produced a manila envelope from her jacket pocket that contained what documentation she'd managed to take when she left. 2 police reports from incidents in Wyoming that had been filed and then dropped, a set of photographs she'd taken herself on a disposable camera, a handwritten log she'd kept for 8 months before she left, recording dates and incidents in the careful shorthand of someone who had understood even then that she might eventually need it. Greer looked through everything without comment. Then he put it down and looked at her. "This is more than most people come in with," he said. "Is it enough?" she said. "It's a foundation." He tapped the edge of the envelope. "The log is valuable. Courts pay attention to contemporaneous documentation, notes made at the time, not reconstructed afterward. The photographs are useful. The police reports are complicated because they were dropped, but they establish a pattern of contact with law enforcement that isn't nothing." He paused. "Has he made any formal legal moves yet? Filed anything?" "Not that I've been served with," Eliza said. "The letter it wasn't legal, it was personal." "That's consistent with what you're describing," Greer said. "Men like this often prefer the informal approach first. It costs them nothing, and it costs you a great deal." He picked up his pen. "Here's what I want you to understand. If he files for custody, and it sounds like he will, the court is going to want to see a stable environment for those children. Where you're living, what your income looks like, what their schooling situation is. All of that matters." Eliza glanced at Wade, almost involuntarily, and then back at Greer. "We're in a stable situation," she said. "I have steady employment, and the children are enrolled at Harlan's Creek Elementary. They've been there since November." "Good," Greer said. He wrote something down. "Now, the man's name." "Derek Vaughn," she said. She said it the same way she'd said it the first time, like lifting something heavy she hadn't wanted to touch. Greer wrote it down and underlined it. "I'll run him. See what comes up in terms of prior record, prior filings, anything public." He looked at her steadily. "I won't pretend this is going to be easy or fast. Custody disputes are ugly under any circumstances, and when one party has been avoiding service and the other party has resources and motivation, they get uglier. But you have a stronger position than you think you do." He closed his legal pad. "My retainer is $1,500. Can you manage that?" There was a pause. Eliza looked at the table. "I'll cover the retainer," Wade said. Eliza turned to him. "Wade, we can argue about it later," he said. "Right now we need him working." Her jaw tightened. She looked at Greer. "I'll pay it back," she said. To Wade, not to Greer. "Every dollar." "I know you will," Wade said, and he meant it entirely. February passed with the tight, held-breath quality of waiting for something you can't see yet, but can hear coming. Greer filed a preemptive custody motion on Eliza's behalf in the second week, which gave them standing in the court system before Derek could establish his own narrative. It was a tactical move, Greer explained. It meant that when Derek eventually made his approach to the court, he'd be responding to their filing rather than setting the terms himself. The ranch continued its winter rhythms. The cattle needed constant attention, and the cold didn't relent, and the work itself was, Wade found, a kind of mercy. It didn't leave enough room in the day for sustained dread. Eliza worked with the same relentless focus as always, but there was a different quality to it now. Something pulled tighter, and there were moments when he caught her scanning the tree line along the north fence or looking down the road when a truck passed on the highway a mile off, her hands going still before she brought them back to what she was doing. The children felt it too, even the ones too young to understand what specifically was happening. Cooper had started waking in the night again, not from storms this time, but from nothing he could name, and Josie had developed a habit of checking the bunkhouse door lock twice before bed. Miles had become quieter than usual, which was saying something, and Nora, who knew more than her younger siblings and was trying to protect them from knowing it, had started doing homework with her back to the wall in every room she sat in. Wade noticed all of it. He said nothing about it directly to the children because it was not his place and because they were not his to manage. But he did things that cost him nothing and mattered in ways he couldn't fully account for. He left the barn light on all night. It was visible from the bunkhouse windows. He made sure he was in the yard at the times the children came and went. He did not talk about Derek Vaughn in front of anyone under 12. One evening, Nora found him replacing a hinge on the barn door and stood watching him for a while in the way she did when she wanted to say something and hadn't decided yet. "My mom trusts you," she said eventually. He kept working on the hinge. "I think so." "She doesn't trust most people," Nora said. "I know. She trusted my dad at first." She said it carefully, not as an accusation but as a fact she was placing between them to see what he would do with it. She was 11 years old, and she was doing the thing that children do when the adults in their lives have failed them, building her own assessment of people, running her own analysis, not willing to rely entirely on anyone else's judgment anymore. He set down the screwdriver and looked at her directly. "That's a fair thing to be careful about," he said. "I'd rather you took your time deciding what you think of me than decided too fast and got it wrong in either direction." She looked at him for a moment. "Miles said you told him not to worry about whether we were squatters." "Miles talks more than he thinks he does," Wade said. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Yeah," she said. "He does." She looked at the barn door. The hinge was wrong before, too, the old one. It always made that noise in the wind. "You noticed that?" "I notice a lot of things," she said. He handed her the screwdriver. "Hold this." She held it with the careful attention she brought to everything, and they finished the hinge together in the cold evening air, and she went back to the bunkhouse without another word, and Wade stood in the barn doorway for a moment looking at the lights across the yard. Derek Vaughn arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of March, which was still winter in the mountains regardless of what the calendar said. Wade was in the far pasture checking a section of fence when he saw the truck coming down the North Fork Road, a late model black pickup, too clean for the county roads, moving at a speed that said the driver wasn't uncertain about where he was going. He watched it from 200 yards away and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite dread and not quite readiness, but somewhere between them. By the time he got back to the yard, the truck was parked and the man was standing outside it, and Wade's first impression of Derek Vaughn was that he looked like exactly what he was, which was a man who had learned how to appear reasonable. He was perhaps 40, lean and put together, with a face that had the kind of surface pleasantness that comes not from actual goodwill, but from long practice at deploying it strategically. He was standing in Wade's yard with his hands in his jacket pockets, and a careful, steady expression, looking around at the property with the ownership instinct of a man who assessed everything he saw in terms of what it was worth and how it could be controlled. He saw Wade coming and arranged his face into something that was almost friendly. "Mr. Callahan," he said, extending a hand. "Derek Vaughn. Appreciate you not calling the police before I could introduce myself." Wade did not shake the hand. "I didn't know you were coming," he said. Derek let the hand drop with a small, patient smile that said he'd expected this and wasn't troubled by it. "I'm here to see my family," he said. "I don't want any trouble. I just want to talk to Eliza and see my kids." "Your attorney can arrange that through ours," Wade said. "That's how this works now." Something behind Derek's eyes went flat and then came back to its neutral setting so quickly that if Wade hadn't been watching for it, he'd have missed it entirely. "I don't want this to be a legal situation," Derek said. He spread his hands slightly. "These are my children. I have a right to see them." "Then your attorney will file the appropriate motion and the court will determine your access," Wade said. "Until then, you're on private property and I'd like you to leave." Derek looked at him for a moment, and Wade looked back, and there was a small exchange in that look that had nothing to do with lawyers or courts. It was older and more direct than that, the simple measurement that men have always done when they understand that something is contested. "You know what she's told you isn't the whole picture," Derek said. His voice had shifted slightly. It was still controlled, still reasonable on the surface, but there was an edge underneath it now, something harder. "She does that. She's very good at making people feel like they're helping her, like they're rescuing something. It's what she does." "Get in your truck," Wade said. "I'm just saying, whatever she's told you about me, whatever story she's built, Get in your truck, Mr. Vaughn. Derek looked at him for another beat, and then he looked past Wade toward the bunkhouse, and his expression did something that Wade didn't like at all. Something that was not about Wade anymore. Something more private and more specific than anything he'd shown in the last 3 minutes. Then he put his pleasant face back on, nodded once, and got in the truck. He drove slowly, which was worse somehow than if he'd driven fast. Wade stood in the yard and watched until the black pickup disappeared down the road, and then he turned and found Eliza standing at the corner of the barn. She had the look of someone who has been through something before and knows exactly how it goes, and is trying to decide whether to be afraid or furious, and is landing on both at once. "How long were you standing there?" he said. "Long enough," she said. Her voice was steady. "You didn't tell him anything." "No?" "He'll come back," she said. "Not like that. He was testing, seeing what he's dealing with." She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at the empty road. "The next time will be different." "I know," Wade said. "I called Greer while I was walking in. He's filing an emergency motion to restrict contact pending the custody hearing." She looked at him. "When did you—" "When I saw his truck turn onto the road," Wade said. She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the pasture and moved her hair. "He said something to you," she said, "about me. I could see it from where I was standing. He said you're good at making people feel like they're rescuing something." She absorbed that without expression. Then, "He's not wrong that I know how to ask for help without looking like I'm asking for it." Her voice was flat. "He taught me that. He'd take everything away and then wait for me to figure out how to get it back without letting anyone see I was trying." She paused. "It was his favorite game." Wade looked at her. "That's not what's happening here." "I know," she said. "That's the thing he doesn't understand. He thinks it is because it's the only way he knows how to read people." She looked at her boots for a moment. "He's going to try to use you. Use the fact that you've done things for us. He'll find a way to make it look like something. Dependency, or worse." "Let him try," Wade said. She looked up at him. "Wade, I need you to understand what you're signing up for if you stand here. He fights dirty. He lies in court. He gets people to lie for him. He finds pressure points and uses them. He will say things about you, about me, about—" She stopped. "I know what he is," Wade said. "You told me." Knowing and being on the receiving end of it are different things. "I understand that." She searched his face for a long moment, and whatever she was looking for, she either found or decided she was done looking. She nodded once, tightly, and went back toward the bunkhouse. He stood in the yard alone for a few minutes and thought about Derek Vaughn's face when he'd looked past Wade toward the bunkhouse. The specific private quality of that look. The way it said, "Those are mine," without being about the children at all. Not really, but about the fact of possession itself and the intolerable disruption of having it removed. He went inside and called Greer again and told him about the visit. And Greer said the words restraining order and violation documentation and emergency hearing, and Wade wrote down what he was told to do and what records he needed to keep and what to do if the black truck appeared again. That night, the bunkhouse light stayed on very late, and Wade did not sleep well, and the winter dark outside his window was very large and the ranch felt smaller than it usually did. And at some point around 2 a.m, he got up and stood in the kitchen and looked at the light in the bunkhouse windows until he was sure it was still on, and then went back to bed. The emergency hearing was set for 3 weeks out, which was fast by the court standards and an eternity by every other measurement. In the interval, Derek Vaughn did what Eliza had said he would do. He went to town. Harlan's Creek was a small place, and small places have long memories and short distances between people. And what Derek did in those 3 weeks was systematic, and Wade had to admit, with the sourness of someone who had underestimated an opponent, effective. He rented a room at the one motel, and he introduced himself to people. At the feed store, at the diner, at the gas station where people stood around and talked on slow mornings. As a father who had been separated from his children by a woman who'd run off in the night and taken them away from him. And he said it with the bewildered, even-tempered grief of a man who had been wronged in a way he couldn't quite understand. He didn't say anything vicious. That was the sophistication of it. He didn't attack Eliza directly or say anything that could be characterized as a threat. He was simply a sad man telling his side of a complicated story, and the story he told was almost entirely about the children. how much he missed them, how worried he was about their stability, how difficult it had been not knowing where they were. He mentioned Wade twice, in the version that got back to Wade through the feed store, and both times the mention had been careful and plausible. She's living on a man's property. My kids are growing up on someone else's ranch. I don't know anything about this man, and neither does anyone else. It was, Wade thought, almost impressive in its construction. Nothing provably false. Everything calibrated to plant doubt in people who didn't have any other information. At the feed store, he heard one of the old men say, "Don't really know much about the woman, come to think of it." He paid for his supplies and drove home and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. What he did instead was make a call to a woman named Patricia Oakes, who ran the county's domestic advocacy organization out of an office above the hardware store, and who had more practical knowledge about how these situations moved through the courts than anyone else he could think of. She came to the ranch on a Saturday and sat with Eliza for 2 hours. And when she came out, her face was the particular professional calm of someone who has heard a story that has confirmed rather than surprised her. "She needs to be at that hearing," Patricia told Wade at the door. "Everything she has needs to be in front of the judge." A man like this banks on a woman being too frightened or too exhausted to fight, and his best-case scenario is that she doesn't show up or shows up so worn down that she can't make her case. She looked at him steadily. "She's going to need people in that courtroom. Not to speak for her, just to be there." "I'll be there," Wade said. "She know that?" "She will," he said. He told Eliza that evening. She was on the bunkhouse porch with a cup of tea, watching the last of the light go off the mountains, and he came and stood on the bottom step and told her he would be at the hearing. "You don't have to," she said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll use it. He'll say something about you being there, some implication." "Let him," Wade said for the second time. She looked at him with an expression that had something tired and something fierce in it in equal measure. "You're stubborn," she said. "It's been mentioned," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly, but close enough that he could see what a smile would look like on her when she wasn't holding everything together with both hands. And it was a thing worth noting. The week before the hearing, Derek escalated. It came in stages, which Greer had told them to expect, and knowing to expect, it didn't make any of it easier. There was a voicemail on Eliza's phone. She'd never changed the number. A small oversight that she'd apparently been afraid to correct for fear of it looking like avoidance to the court, in which Derek's voice was calm and reasonable and said that he understood they were going through a difficult process, and he hoped they could resolve this between themselves without putting the children through a long court proceeding. The message was precisely calibrated, Patricia Oakes said, when they played it for her. There was nothing in it that was overtly threatening, but there was enough in the phrasing to communicate clearly that between ourselves meant on his terms, without the court, without witnesses, without documentation. Greer had the call transcribed and filed it. Then Derek appeared at the school. He didn't go inside. He stood across the street from Harlan's Creek Elementary at dismissal time, visible from the front doors. And he watched. He didn't approach. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply stood there in his clean jacket and let himself be seen. And Miles, who had sharp eyes and a good memory for faces he'd been shown in photographs, saw him and went very still, in the way that Miles went still when something was wrong, and told the teacher, and the teacher called Eliza, and Eliza called Greer, and by the time anyone was in a position to respond, Derek was gone. He had not violated the terms of the emergency order, which required only that he not make contact. Standing on a public sidewalk was not making contact, and he knew that, and everyone knew he knew that. That night, for the first time, Eliza came to Wade's door. He opened it, and she stood there in the cold with her jacket pulled around her, and she said flatly, "I need to ask you something." "Come in," he said. She came in and stood in his kitchen, not sitting, and said, "I need the children to be in the main house until after the hearing. Nora saw a truck she didn't recognize on the highway this afternoon, and she's been sitting with her back to the wall in every room since 4 o'clock. Josie won't let go of Cooper. Miles—" She stopped. Her jaw worked. "Miles told me tonight that he's been checking the bunkhouse door every hour after bedtime." Wade absorbed that. "The bunkhouse is 2 separate," she said. "If something happened at night—" She stopped again, and he could see the cost of what she was saying, the thing it required her to set down in order to ask it. I know what I'm asking. I know what it looks like, what people will... Eliza, he said. Stop. She stopped. The downstairs bedroom is bigger, he said. Nora and Josie can take it. There's a daybed in the study. Miles can take that. Cooper can go in the small room off the kitchen. He paused. There's room. She looked at him. You don't have to... There's room, he said again. She was silent for a long moment, and he could see the war inside her between the part that had spent 18 months making herself not need anything from anyone, and the part that was a mother with 4 children who were not sleeping through the night because a man they were afraid of had stood across the street from their school that afternoon. Thank you, she said, and it was the same stripped, plain thank you as the first one, and it cost her the same amount. We'll move you in the morning, he said. She nodded and left, and he stood in his kitchen and looked at the space where she'd been standing. And outside the window the night was deep and cold, and the stars were very clear in the way they get at altitude. And somewhere on the highway a pair of headlights moved north and then were gone. The children moved into the main house on a Saturday, in the way children move, which is to say with enormous enthusiasm and no organizational efficiency whatsoever. Cooper immediately identified every room of the house as potentially his and had to be redirected 3 times before accepting the small room off the kitchen, which he then declared to be the best room he had ever seen, a position he maintained with great conviction throughout the morning. Josie brought her rock collection, which was more substantial than Wade had realized, and arranged it along the windowsill of the downstairs bedroom with a precision that suggested she had given this layout serious prior thought. Miles accepted the daybed in the study with the quiet adaptation he brought to everything, and immediately noticed the bookshelf and started pulling volumes out to examine them, which Wade found entirely agreeable. Nora moved her things in without commentary and then found Wade in the kitchen. Are we staying after the hearing? She asked, direct, the way she always was. I don't know yet, Wade said. That depends on a lot of things. Does it depend on what my mom wants or what the court wants? Both, he said. And what you want, all of you. She considered this. I want to stay, she said plainly. Miles wants to stay. Josie will want whatever Mom wants. Cooper doesn't understand enough about what's happening to want anything specific. She looked at him. You should know that. I do now, Wade said. She nodded with the satisfaction of a person who has delivered necessary information and went to help her mother. Eliza, for her part, moved through the house with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything, fitting her family into the available space without making too much of it. She took the couch. Wade had offered her the second upstairs bedroom, and she had declined without discussion. And she arranged it in the practical, no-nonsense way of someone who had slept in worse places and was not going to make a production of this one. The last thing she brought in from the bunkhouse was the manila envelope, which she put on the kitchen table and looked at for a moment. I've been thinking about the hearing, she said. What about it? Greer says I need to be prepared for Derek to say things about me on the stand. Things that sound true because they're built on real events that he's going to describe in a way that's exactly backward. She kept her eyes on the envelope. He's very good at that. He can take a moment where he was the one causing harm and tell it back in a way where I'm the problem. Greer will be ready for that, Wade said. I know. She paused. I need to be ready for it too. For hearing him say those things out loud in front of people. She finally looked up. I haven't talked about most of it out loud. 18 months and I've talked about it in practical terms. Here's what happened. Here's what I need you to do. But not, she stopped. The things he did. The specific things. I've been holding them as information. I haven't let them be anything else. He sat down at the table across from her. You don't have to tell me, he said. I know, she said. But I think I need to say some of it to someone before I say it in a courtroom. She looked at him with the level, careful look he'd come to know. I'm not asking you to fix it. I know you can't. I'm just asking you to listen. I can do that, he said. She was quiet for a moment, organizing it internally, and then she started talking, and he listened, and the kitchen was warm, and the children were settling into their rooms overhead, and outside the window the Colorado dark was absolute, and the things she told him were not easy to hear. He held them the way she needed them held, without flinching away, without offering anything she hadn't asked for, just present. That was all she'd asked for, just someone to be there. By the time she was done, the coffee was cold, and the house had gone quiet with the specific silence of sleeping children. "Thank you," she said, for the third time since he'd known her, and this one was the longest word she'd ever said to him. He nodded. He didn't try to make it into something. He just nodded, and she gathered herself, and she went to check on the children, and Wade sat at the table for a long time after, looking at the cold coffee and the manila envelope, and the family that was not his, and was somehow, in the way that things happen without being decided, not entirely not his either. The hearing was 6 days away. Derek Vaughn was somewhere in the county, and he was not the kind of man who went away on his own. The 6 days before the hearing did not pass quietly. Derek filed a counter-motion on the Monday of that week, a document that Greer faxed to the ranch and that Wade read standing at the kitchen counter while Eliza sat at the table and the children were at school. It was 23 pages long, and it was, as Greer had warned them to expect, a work of careful construction. Derek was not asking for full custody. He was asking for joint custody with primary residence, which sounded moderate and reasonable and was, in the specific context of these particular people, a mechanism for control that had nothing to do with the children and everything to do with the fact that joint custody with primary residence would require Eliza to maintain a fixed address and a predictable schedule and regular contact with a man whose central interest in the proceeding was the restoration of access to a person who had left him. The motion described Eliza as unstable. It used the word several times in different contexts. Unstable living situation, unstable employment history, pattern of instability, with the particular frequency of a document that understood that repetition creates its own weight independent of evidence. It described the children as having been removed from a stable family home without cause. It mentioned Wade Callahan by name twice, characterizing his property as an informal arrangement of unclear duration and his relationship with Eliza as undisclosed in nature, which was the kind of phrasing that implied things without stating them. Eliza read it without expression. When she finished, she set it face down on the table. "How much of this can he make stick?" she asked. "Greer says the instability argument is weak given that the children have been in consistent schooling since November and you have documented employment," Wade said. "The implication about me is what he called a soft attack. It's designed to make the judge curious, not to prove anything." "It'll make the judge look at us differently," she said. "Maybe," Wade said. "Or maybe it'll look like what it is, which is a man throwing everything at the wall." He sat down across from her. "Greer wants to meet tomorrow morning. He's got something." She looked up. "What kind of something?" He ran Derek like he said he would, public record, prior filings. He found a restraining order from 2019 in Cheyenne County, a woman named Sandra Brill. It was filed and then withdrawn. Eliza was very still. "He was with someone before me, between you. You were separated for 14 months in 2018 and 2019. "I didn't know about her," she said. Her voice had gone careful and measured in the way it did when she was processing something that required her to revise a map she'd thought was complete. "He told me he'd been alone that whole time, that he'd been trying to get himself right." She looked at the window. "I believed him. That's when I went back." She was quiet for a moment. "That's when Cooper was born." Wade didn't say anything. He waited. "If Sandra Brill will talk," Eliza said slowly, "that's a pattern. Not just my word against his. That's what Greer said." She pressed her hands flat on the table, and he could see her thinking. Not panicking, not spiraling, but working the problem the way she worked structural problems on a job site, finding the load-bearing elements, testing the angles. "Can he find her?" she said. "He's already looking," Wade said. "Oop." Sandra Brill was located in Fort Collins by Greer's paralegal on Tuesday afternoon. She was 37 years old, and she worked as an office manager for a surveying company, and she had, it turned out, been waiting for someone to call for approximately 4 years. She agreed to provide a written affidavit and said, with the particular steadiness of someone who had assembled their courage over a long period of time, that she would appear in person at the hearing if the court required it. Greer called this development significant. Wade thought significant was an understatement. Eliza, when she heard, sat down on the bottom stair of the ranch house and put her face in her hands for about 30 seconds. And then she took her hands away and her face was completely composed. And she said, "She didn't deserve what he did to her." "No," Wade said. "Neither of us did." "No," he said again. She looked up at him from the stair. I keep trying to figure out when I became someone who needed rescuing, she said. I was never, before him, I was never that person. I knew how to do things. I knew how to take care of myself. You still are that person, Wade said. You've been doing it this whole time. Barely. Barely counts, he said. Barely is what kept your children alive for 18 months. Barely built that cabin wall straight enough to pass county inspection. He paused. Barely is not nothing. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between exasperated and something more complicated than that. You're doing that thing again, she said. What thing? Where you say the exact thing that makes it hard to keep feeling sorry for myself. I'll try to be less useful, he said. She made the sound that was almost a laugh, the short, real one that escaped before she could decide whether to let it. And then she stood up from the stair and went to check on the children, and Wade stood in the hallway and was quietly, privately, glad that she'd let herself make that sound. The night before the hearing, none of them slept much. Wade knew this because the house had a particular acoustic quality in the deep hours, and he heard Cooper get up twice and pad down the hall to Eliza's room, and heard her low voice settling him back. He heard Miles moving in the study around 2, the soft sound of the daybed shifting. Nora, he suspected, did not sleep at all, though she made no sound. She was a girl who had learned to be invisible in her wakefulness. He got up at 4 and went to the kitchen and made coffee, and Eliza was already there. She was sitting at the table in the same clothes she'd had on the evening before, her hair loose, a cup in front of her that suggested she'd been there for a while. She looked up when he came in, and neither of them said anything about the hour. He poured a cup and sat down. Tell me something that has nothing to do with tomorrow, she said. He thought about it. When I was 9 years old, I got on a horse I wasn't supposed to get on, and she ran me under a low branch, and I fell off and broke my collarbone, he said. My father had to drive me to the hospital in town, and the whole way he kept saying, I told you, in this voice that was trying to be mad but kept coming out relieved. And I remember thinking, even at 9, with a broken collarbone, that being the thing your father is relieved about is one of the better things you can be. She looked at him. Do you miss him? Every day, he said. He was a difficult man and he wasn't right about everything, and I miss him every single day. She turned the cup in her hands. My father left when I was 7, she said. I don't miss him. I miss the idea of him sometimes. The version I invented. She paused. I always swore I wouldn't do that to my kids. Leave them with an invention instead of a real person. She looked at the table. I don't know if I've managed that. Ask Nora, Wade said. She'll give you an honest answer. That's what I'm afraid of, Eliza said. But the way she said it was not entirely without wry self-awareness, and he thought that was a good sign for a woman who was going to need to walk into a courtroom in 5 hours. They sat in the kitchen while the dark thinned toward morning, and they didn't talk about Derek, or the hearing, or the countermotion, or Sandra Brill, or any of the machinery of what was coming. They talked about the ranch, about what the spring work would look like, about the cabin that was now finished, and whether it might eventually be useful as a proper rental. They talked about Miles and the horses in the way two people who have watched the same child and noticed the same things talk, with a shared shorthand that had developed without either of them planning it. Around 5:30, Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school clothes, fully dressed at 5:30 in the morning, and looked at both of them with an expression that contained everything she understood about this day and had decided not to say. I made my own lunch, she said. Okay, baby, Eliza said. Miles is still asleep. Cooper wet the bed. Okay. Eliza set down her cup and stood. Thank you for telling me. Nora looked at Wade for a moment. Good luck today, she said, with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what she was wishing luck on. Thank you, Nora, sir, he said. She went back down the hall, and Eliza followed to deal with Cooper, and the kitchen was briefly empty and then full of the particular noise of a family morning in all its imperfect, uncoordinated, necessary life. The Larimer County Courthouse was a 40-minute drive from the ranch. Patricia Oakes met them in the parking lot with the file copies Greer needed, and Greer himself arrived 3 minutes later with his paralegal and the organized precision of a man who had done this many times and understood that preparation was the only thing you could control. Wade had arranged for the children to be kept by the school's aftercare program for the day. Nora had accepted this without complaint. Cooper had accepted it with a level of complaint that was essentially theatrical and had no real distress in it. Miles had looked at Wade before he got in Eliza's truck that morning and said quietly, "Tell me what happens." And Wade had said, "I will." And that had been the whole exchange. The courtroom was smaller than Wade expected. He'd built it up in his mind over the weeks of preparation into something vast and institutional, but it was just a room with a flag in the corner and wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that was not kind to anyone's face. There were about 15 people in the gallery when they arrived, which was more than he'd expected for a custody hearing, and he recognized 3 of them from Harlan's Creek, people who had either heard about the case through the ordinary channels of small-town information or had been told about it by Derek Vaughn during his 3 weeks of quiet campaigning at the diner and the feed store. Derek was already there. He was sitting at the respondent's table with an attorney Wade didn't recognize. Not local, someone brought in from Fort Collins or further, a man in a suit that had more resources in it than anything else in the room. Derek was dressed carefully, nothing flashy, the same studied reasonableness he'd deployed in Wade's yard, and he looked across the room when they came in with an expression of mild, patient concern that was almost perfectly constructed. Almost. Wade had been watching him for long enough now to see the thing underneath it, the specific quality of a man looking at something he believes is his and has temporarily mislaid. Eliza did not look at Derek when she came in. She sat down next to Greer and opened her folder and looked at her papers, and Wade sat in the gallery directly behind her and thought about what she'd said at 3 in the morning 3 weeks ago. "I've been holding them as information. I haven't let them be anything else." He thought about what it had cost her to say all of it out loud, and what it was going to cost her to say it here. Patricia Oakes sat beside Wade. She had a notepad and a pen and the calm of someone who had sat in this room before. "She's ready," Patricia said quietly, not looking at him. "I know," he said. The judge was a woman in her late 50s named Howell, with close-cut gray hair and reading glasses she took on and off with a rhythm that seemed to be connected to her level of patience with what she was hearing. She ran a disciplined courtroom without being theatrical about it, and when Derek's attorney made his opening with the polished, reasonable tone of a man who had been paid considerable money to make Derek Vaughn sound like a concerned father, she listened without expression, making notes. When Greer spoke, he was quieter. He laid out the timeline without drama, the documented incidents, the pattern of control, the police contacts in Wyoming, the 8 months of daily log entries. He mentioned Sandra Brill. He mentioned the restraining order from Cheyenne County. He mentioned the letter left under the windshield wiper on the Running Sea property, which had been filed with the court as Exhibit 7, and he mentioned the appearance outside the elementary school, which was Exhibit 9. Derek's attorney objected to the characterization of the school appearance as intimidation, and Judge Howell looked at him over her glasses and said, "The characterization is noted. Continue, Mr. Greer." Derek testified in the morning session. He was, Wade had to grant him, very good at it. He spoke about his children with a warmth that sounded genuine, and perhaps was, in some form, Wade thought, because the most effective manipulation is the kind built on something real. He described his marriage as difficult, but his intentions as honest. He described the night Eliza left as a shock, unprovoked, the action of a woman in crisis. He described his attempts to locate his children as the reasonable behavior of a worried father. His attorney walked him through each exhibit Greer had filed, and Derek had an explanation for every one of them. Not lies, exactly, or not only lies, but the same events told from an angle that made everything look different. Wade watched Eliza's back during this. She sat very still. She wrote 2 notes on her legal pad and passed them to Greer, both of which were clearly factual corrections to things Derek had said, and otherwise she held herself completely steady. The log was where Derek's attorney spent the most time. He characterized it as a record of grievances kept by a woman building a case rather than a contemporaneous account of actual events. He used the word selective 3 times. He suggested that a woman with the presence of mind to keep daily documentation was not a woman in fear, but a woman with a strategy. Greer handled the redirect calmly. He asked Derek's attorney, for the record, whether he was suggesting that victims of ongoing abuse should not document their experiences, and the attorney said that wasn't what he'd said. and Greer said he was happy to revisit the specific language. Judge Howell made a note. Eliza testified in the afternoon. She was sworn in and she sat in the chair and she looked at Greer, not at Derek, and she answered every question in the same measured, direct way she did everything. Not performing distress, not overclaiming, not hedging. She described specific incidents from the log by date. She described the night she left in plain language that was more devastating for its plainness than any dramatization would have been. She described the 18 months afterward, the moves, the work she'd found, the line camp, the children she had kept in school every week of every month, regardless of how far she'd had to drive or what condition the roads were in. Derek's attorney cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He was skilled and he knew where to push, and he pushed. He asked about the gaps in her documentation, the periods before she'd started the log when nothing was filed and nothing was recorded. He asked about her employment history, the moves, the schools the children had attended before Harlan's Creek. He asked about Wade Callahan, the nature of the arrangement, the living situation, the fact that she and her children had relocated from an outbuilding to the main house of a man they had known for 5 months. "Is Mr. Callahan your employer?" the attorney asked. "Yes," Eliza said. "Is he anything else?" Greer objected. Judge Howell sustained it. The attorney rephrased. "Do you consider your living arrangement with Mr. Callahan to be a stable situation for your children?" "Yes," Eliza said. "The children are in consistent schooling, in a structurally sound home, on a working property where they have routine and space and safety. That is more than they had before." She paused. "That is more than they had for years before." "Because of Mr. Callahan," the attorney said. "Because I put them there," she said. "Because I made choices that led to that situation. Mr. Callahan offered resources that I evaluated and accepted. I did that. My children are safe because I kept them alive long enough to find a situation where they could be." The attorney looked at her for a moment. Then he moved on. Wade in the gallery let out a breath. Sandra Brill testified in the late afternoon by video link from Fort Collins because Greer had anticipated that asking her to travel might give her room to reconsider. She appeared on a screen to the left of the bench, sitting at a desk in a plain room, and she spoke for 22 minutes. She was steady, not cold. There were moments where her voice shifted slightly, and she paused to let it settle, but steady. She described her relationship with Derek Vaughn, the same patterns, the same mechanisms, the same careful management of what she knew and didn't know, and she described the night she'd filed the restraining order, and she described why she'd withdrawn it. She used the phrase, "I was afraid of what would happen if I kept going," without elaborating, and she didn't need to elaborate. Derek's attorney cross-examined her briefly. He questioned her motivations for coming forward now. She said simply that she'd been contacted and she'd decided it was the right thing to do. He asked if she had any ongoing grievance against Derek Vaughn. She said she had no ongoing contact with him at all and preferred to keep it that way. When she was done, Judge Howell looked at Derek for a long moment over her glasses. It was not a comfortable look to be on the receiving end of, Wade thought. Derek held it with his reasonable face, but something around his eyes was different from what it had been in the morning, something tighter. The hearing continued for parts of 2 more days, the logistical back and forth of custody law, financial documentation, school records, the formal report from Patricia Oakes's organization on the family's situation, Greer's final argument. Derek's attorney made a closing that was polished and made the most of what he had, which by the end of the second day was less than it had been at the start. Judge Howell did not rule immediately. She said she would issue a written decision within 10 days, which was the standard, and she dismissed the session without any indication of which way she was leaning. Derek's attorney gathered his files with professional equanimity. Derek himself stood for a moment looking across the room at Eliza, and Eliza looked back at him, not flinching, not aggressive, just looking with the level, steady gaze of someone who has said everything they needed to say and is done being afraid of the response. Derek looked away first. In the parking lot, Greer told them the hearing had gone well. He said it carefully, with the practiced caution of a lawyer who has learned not to make promises about courts. But he said it, and Wade believed him. Patricia Oakes hugged Eliza, which Eliza accepted with only slight rigidity. Wade stood by the truck while Greer walked Eliza through the next steps, and he looked at the courthouse, and the parking lot, and the ordinary business of people coming and going from an ordinary county building on an ordinary afternoon. And he thought about Nora in the kitchen at 5:30 that morning saying good luck today with the gravity of an adult who had been carrying adult weight for years. And he thought about Cooper asking if these were his cows. And he thought about Miles with the bay mare's nose on his shoulder. Eliza came to the truck and he opened the passenger door and she got in without saying anything for a moment. 10 days, she said. 10 days, he said. What do I do for 10 days? Same thing you've been doing, he said. Work. Take care of your kids. Trust that you put everything on the table that needed to be there. She leaned her head back against the headrest and looked at the ceiling of the truck. I'm so tired, she said. Not complaining, just stating it as a fact the way she stated most things. I know, he said. She turned her head to look at him. Thank you for being there. You already know I was going to be, he said. Knowing it and having it be true aren't always the same thing, she said. He thought about that for a moment. No, he said. They're not always. She looked at him for a beat longer than she usually looked at him when she was cataloging what was in front of her, and then she looked out the windshield at the road back to the ranch. Let's go get the kids, she said. He started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot and headed north, and the mountains were ahead of them in the late afternoon light, still carrying their winter snow at the high elevations, solid and unchanged and entirely indifferent to the human machinery of courts and documents and fear that had been occupying the last several months. And there was something both humbling and steadying about that. The way landscape always is when you're small enough inside a day to need the reminder that the world is larger than any one thing happening in it. Derek Vaughn was still out there somewhere in the county. The 10 days had not yet started. The 10 days were the longest of that year, and that year had not been short on long days. Life on the ranch continued in the way that life insists on continuing, regardless of what is pending. The cattle needed feeding, the fences needed checking, the children needed driving to school and picking up again, and meals needed to appear on the table at roughly predictable intervals. Wade had always understood work as a form of sanity maintenance, and in those 10 days he leaned on that understanding harder than usual. He fixed the barn roof section that had been soft since autumn. He regraded the drive with the tractor. He did the kind of thorough, methodical maintenance that a property accumulates into a backlog over years of one man managing too much. And he did it without particular urgency, one thing at a time, the way his father had always said a ranch got kept. Not by heroics, but by consistency. Eliza worked beside him, not always on the same task, but alongside, in the way they had developed over months. A shared presence on the land that didn't require constant negotiation. She finished the interior trim work on the repaired cabin, which had been the last outstanding piece of the original job, and she did it with the same precision she brought to everything, the same refusal to approximate where accuracy was achievable. When she was done, she stood in the doorway of the cabin for a moment, looking at what had been a pine-through-the-roof disaster 7 months earlier, and Wade came to stand beside her, and they looked at it together. Your father would think it's acceptable, she said. High praise, Wade said. I meant it as high praise, she said. He believed her. The children moved through those 10 days each in their own way. Cooper, who understood the least, was in some respects the most reliable barometer of the household's emotional temperature. He was happy when things felt stable and went quiet in that telling way when they didn't. And during those 10 days, he was mostly happy, which Wade took as information. Josie had developed the habit, sometime in the weeks since moving into the main house, of leaving small objects on Wade's workbench in the barn. A particularly good rock, a bird feather, once a drawing of what was clearly intended to be a horse but had the proportions of a small building. He never commented on these offerings, and neither did she, and this seemed to be the correct approach for both of them. Miles had started helping with the horses in a formal way. Not just watching from the fence. Wade had given him actual tasks, the simple daily work of the paddock, and the boy did them with a seriousness and a growing competence that was satisfying to watch in the way that watching any person develop a real skill is satisfying. The bay mare had established a clear preference for Miles that was now openly acknowledged by both of them. Nora was the one who was hardest to read, because she was working very hard at being readable only on her own terms. She went to school, she did her work, she helped in the evenings with a reliable efficiency, and she said very little about the hearing or the waiting or Derek Vaughn or any of it. But Wade had developed, over months of careful observation, a reasonable understanding of how Nora moved through rooms when she was holding something heavy, and she was holding something heavy all 10 days. He found her in the barn on the 8th evening, sitting on a hay bale with her knees pulled up, not doing anything, just sitting. He came in and did what he needed to do with the feed situation, and then sat down on the bale across from her. "You don't have to talk," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. The horses moved in their stalls. "What if the judge decides wrong?" she said, not looking at him, looking at the middle distance of the barn. He thought about it honestly because she was the kind of person who needed honesty more than comfort, and knew the difference immediately. "Then we go back," he said. "Greer appeals. We find more evidence. We don't stop." "But what if he gets access? In the meantime, supervised visits at minimum, in a public location, with documentation. That's the worst case while we keep fighting." He paused. "It would be hard. I won't tell you otherwise, but it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be the way it was before. You understand the difference?" She was quiet for a moment. "Before was no one knowing," she said. "Right," he said. "Now people know. The court knows. Patricia Oakes knows. Greer knows. I know." He looked at her. "You are not invisible anymore. None of you are. That's different from before in a way that doesn't go away regardless of what the judge decides." Nora looked at her hands. She was 11 years old and she had the interior life of someone twice that, which was both her greatest strength and the thing about her situation that Wade found hardest to sit with. The way hardship had built something real in her at a cost that should never have been asked of a child. "My mom cries sometimes at night," Nora said. "When she thinks we're all asleep. She tries to be quiet about it." "I know," Wade said. "She's not weak," Nora said. It came out with a fierceness that said this was something she'd been needing to say to someone for a long time. "I know that too," Wade said. "Crying at night when you've been holding everything together all day is not weakness. It's what's left over. It's the cost of the holding." He paused. "Your mom is one of the strongest people I've ever known. I don't say that to make you feel better. I say it because it's an accurate assessment." Nora looked at him for a moment, and he saw the thing in her face that she rarely let show. Not the composed, watchful girl who managed everything, but the child who was still in there underneath all that management, tired and frightened and wanting very badly for someone reliable to be between her and the things she was afraid of. She didn't say anything else, but she sat in the barn for another 20 minutes while he finished the evening work. And when she left, she said goodnight in a way that meant something more than the words, and he said goodnight back in a way that tried to answer what she'd actually said. The letter from the court arrived on the morning of the 10th day. Greer called at 7:15. Wade was already up, and Eliza was in the kitchen with the children eating breakfast. And he took the call in the hallway and listened and said yes several times and thank you and came back into the kitchen. Eliza looked at him from across the table. The children were eating. Cooper had oatmeal on his chin. Miles was reading a book propped against the orange juice. Josie was feeding small pieces of toast to herself with the systematic focus of a scientist conducting an experiment. Nora was watching Wade's face. "Full custody," he said. "Primary residence with you. Supervised visitation only at the court's discretion, contingent on completion of a counseling program. Permanent protective order." The table was very quiet. Eliza put down her coffee cup. She did it carefully, making sure it was fully on the table before she let go. Then she pressed both hands flat on the tabletop and looked at them. "Mom?" Nora said. "We're okay," Eliza said. Her voice was steady, but it had something in it that was barely contained, a pressure behind the steadiness that was looking for somewhere to go. Cooper looked up from his oatmeal. "Did something happen?" "Something good," Miles said, without looking up from his book. He had been watching from behind the pages. He knew. "How good?" Cooper asked. "Pretty good," Wade said. He sat back down at his end of the table. "Eat your oatmeal." Cooper considered this information and returned to his oatmeal. Josie put down her toast and looked at her mother with quiet, careful eyes, and Eliza reached over and put her hand over Josie's hand, and Josie turned her hand over and held it. Wade looked at the table, the ordinary mess of a family breakfast, the dishes and the orange juice carton and the book and the oatmeal and the piece of toast Josie had set down. He looked at it and thought about the line camp shack in the hills and the $200 and the truck with the bad tire, and about all the mornings between there and this one. Under the table, he felt something bump his knee. He looked down. Cooper had climbed off his chair and was standing beside Wade's leg, not asking for anything, just standing there with oatmeal on his chin, in the specific way that small children stand close to people they trust. Wade put his hand briefly on the top of the boy's head, and Cooper went back to his chair. Nora was watching this. Nora was always watching. She looked at Wade for a moment with those careful eyes, and then she looked at her mother and something in her face changed. Not dramatically, not in a way she would have wanted observed, but something loosened like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long it had become structural and was now, cautiously, beginning to release. Derek Vaughn did not accept the ruling quietly, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. He appeared at the property 3 days after the decision, not in his truck this time, on foot, coming up the fire road from the highway in a way that suggested he'd parked somewhere he didn't want seen, and the fact of his parking somewhere he didn't want seen was itself a communication about his intentions. Wade saw him coming across the north field from the upstairs window, a figure moving through the brown March grass with a purpose that had nothing patient in it, and he called the sheriff's department and then went downstairs. He told Eliza simply and without alarm, and she took the children to the back of the house, and he went out to meet Derek in the yard. Derek had covered the remaining distance quickly, and he came into the yard with the controlled energy of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it past the point of thinking. He was not the put-together, reasonable-faced man from the courthouse or the initial visit. He was something rawer now, something that the court decision had stripped the presentation off of, and what was underneath was smaller and meaner and more dangerous than the performance had been. "Where are my kids?" he said. Not a question. "They're not available to you," Wade said. "You have a protective order against you, and you're currently in violation of it by being on this property." "I want to see my kids." His voice had an edge in it that was fraying at the margins. "That's all I want. That's all any of this has ever been about. She took my children, and she turned everyone against me, and all I've ever wanted." "Derek," Wade kept his voice level, "the sheriff is on the way. If you leave now, you're in violation of the order, but you leave on your own terms. If you stay, you're arrested here, and that becomes part of your record for any future motion you try to file." Something moved across Derek's face, the rational part, the part that had always known how to calculate odds and make tactical decisions, flickering on for a moment behind the raw thing that was driving him now. Wade watched it happen. He watched Derek do the math and come up with the answer that said go, and watched him decide to ignore it. "She did this," Derek said. "She took everything. And then she found someone to help her take the rest, and she stood up there in that courtroom and said whatever she needed to say. She told the truth," Wade said. "That's what she said. That's her version, and Sandra Brill's version, and the police report's version, and your own behavior's version, Derek. The version of you standing outside in elementary school, the letter under a windshield wiper, the version that just walked across a field to a property with a protective order because you didn't like what a judge decided." Wade looked at him steadily. "There's a pattern here, and you're in it, and the only person who doesn't see it is you." Derek stared at him. The fraying at the edges of his composure had gotten worse in the last minute, and Wade could see the decision being made in real time. The calculation losing ground to the impulse winning. He'd seen it coming, and he was still not entirely prepared for the speed of it. Derek moved toward the house. Wade stepped in front of him, and Derek shoved him, hard, and that was the end of the part of this that was about talking. Wade had not been in a fight since he was in his 20s, but some things don't entirely leave the body, and what he did was not sophisticated. He got hold of Derek and he put him on the ground with the kind of unglamorous, effortful grappling that real physical confrontation almost always is, nothing like the clean mechanics of movies. And he held him there with a weight advantage and considerably more experience of manual labor than Derek Vaughn had developed in his lifetime. Derek fought and swore and tried 3 times to get loose, and on the 3rd attempt partially succeeded, and Wade's cheekbone connected with Derek's elbow in a way that was going to leave a mark. And then there were sirens on the highway, and Derek went still. He went still, the way people go still, when the calculation finally wins, suddenly and completely, the fight leaving him all at once and leaving something smaller and more ordinary in its place. Wade sat back on his heels and breathed. "Don't get up," he said. Derek lay in the yard mud and didn't get up. The two sheriff's deputies came across the yard at a pace that suggested they'd read the situation from the drive and understood it, and Wade stood and stepped back and let them do their work. One of them looked at his face. The cheekbone was already swelling, and raised an eyebrow. He resisted, Wade said. Noted, the deputy said, and went back to Derek. The door of the house opened and Eliza came out. She had clearly been watching from the window and had held herself inside until the deputies had control of the situation, which was the right call, and also, he suspected, an act of considerable restraint. She came across the yard and looked at Wade's face. "How bad?" she said. "It's fine," he said. "You keep saying things are fine when they have visible evidence against that position," she said. "Old habit," he said. She looked at Derek being cuffed in the yard, and the expression on her face was complicated in a way he didn't try to read completely. There was no satisfaction in it. There was something that might have been grief, or the remnant of grief, for whatever a thing had been before it became what it was now. And there was something else underneath that. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first structural element of what relief would eventually build itself on. "It's over," she said. "Not to him, not to anyone, just saying it." "The legal part is mostly over," he said. "There'll be more filings. He'll be charged for the protective order violation and the assault. It'll take time." "I know," she said. "I don't mean the legal part." He looked at her. "The running," she said. "I mean, the running is over. Whatever happens with courts and filings and any of that, I'm done running." She said it with a flatness that was not defeat but the opposite of defeat. A settling. A decision made and finished. Derek was in the back of the deputy's car. The yard was quiet in the way yards go quiet after something has happened in them. The horses were visible in the far paddock, moving along the fence line in that curious, alert way horses move when there has been noise and it has stopped. Nora appeared in the doorway of the house. She looked at the deputy's car, and then at her mother, and then at Wade and his face. "He's bleeding," she announced. "It's not serious," Eliza said. "It looks serious." "I'm going to need someone to disagree with the two of you," Wade said. Miles had appeared behind Nora, and behind Miles, Josie, and behind Josie, the small shape of Cooper squeezing between his siblings to see what was happening. They stood in the doorway, the four of them, in order of height, and they looked at the deputy's car, and the yard, and Wade's cheekbone, and their mother's face, and Cooper said, with the directness that was his particular gift, "Did you win?" Wade looked at the boy. "Yeah," he said. "We won." Cooper considered this. "Okay," he said, and went back inside to whatever he'd been doing, because at 4 years old, a clear outcome is sufficient information, and further analysis is optional. The assault charge and the protective order violation added to Derek Vaughn's legal situation in ways that Greer said significantly reduced the possibility of any successful future custody motion. He pled to a reduced charge 3 months later and received a suspended sentence with conditions, one of which was the completion of the counseling program the court had already required, and another of which was no contact with Eliza Hart or her children for a minimum of 5 years. Greer called to deliver this news on a Tuesday afternoon in June. Wade was in the vegetable garden, Josie's project, which had expanded from a modest beginning to a 6-bed operation that required a degree of structural support she had recruited him for. And Eliza was nearby, and he handed her the phone and listened to half of a conversation that was mostly her saying yes and okay and thank you in a voice that went through several different registers before settling. She handed the phone back. He finished the call with Greer, who said good outcome with the satisfied brevity of a man who had worked hard for something and was pleased to have it recognized. Eliza was standing at the edge of the garden, looking at the mountains, which in June still had snow at the high peaks but were beginning to go green below the timberline. The afternoon light was long and warm, and it had been a reasonable spring by Colorado standards. More rain than usual, which meant the pastures were in good shape and the cattle were in better condition than they'd been the previous year. "He's not going away forever," she said. "No," Wade said. 5 years is 5 years. "I know." She turned from the mountains. "But 5 years is... The kids grow so much in 5 years. By the time anything could realistically restart, Cooper will be 9, Miles will be 14, Nora will be almost 17. She paused. "They'll be different people. I'll have had 5 years to make sure they're different people." You've been doing that since before you left, Wade said. She looked at him with the look that had shifted over the months. Still measuring, still direct, but the wariness had changed its quality. It had become something more like the careful attention of a person who has decided another person is worth watching because they find them genuinely interesting, which is a very different thing from watching for danger. I need to ask you something, she said. All right. She seemed to be organizing it, choosing the words with the specificity she brought to structural decisions. What are we doing? She said. You and me. What is this? He looked at her for a moment. The afternoon was warm and the garden was growing well, and the ranch was, for the first time in years, not quiet in the way that had been its problem before. I think that's up to both of us to decide, he said. I know it is. She held his gaze. I'm asking what you want, not what you're willing to do, what you actually want. He thought about it honestly, because she had earned honesty, and because anything less would have been an insult to both of them. I want you to stay, he said. I want the kids to stay. I want what we've been building here to keep being built. He paused. I'm not going to pretend I've got this perfectly figured out because I don't, but I know what I want when I'm clear-eyed about it. She looked at him for a long time. He held it without adding to it, because he'd said what was true, and more words would only complicate it. I'm not easy, she said finally. I noticed, he said. I have 4 children. I also noticed that. I'm going to be suspicious of things for longer than is probably rational. I'm going to have bad days that have nothing to do with you. I'm going to need to build things at my own pace, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not asking you to, he said. She looked at him with an expression that was still working through something, still turning it over. Then something in it settled, not all at once, not cleanly, but in the way real things settle, unevenly and partially, and enough. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no grand gestures. The horses were in the paddock, and Josie's tomatoes were coming in, and somewhere in the house, Cooper was making the specific kind of noise that meant he was either very happy or about to break something. It was ordinary in the particular way that the things that matter most tend to be ordinary when they actually happen. Not like the movies make them, but quieter and realer and more durable for being so. The summer that followed was the kind that stays in a person's memory without their choosing to keep it. Wade had not understood until that summer how much of his daily life had been a kind of background silence. Not peaceful silence, but the silence of a space that had once had more in it and hadn't recovered. 3 years of running a ranch alone, of meals eaten standing over the sink, of evenings that ended early because there was nothing to extend them for. He hadn't been miserable. He'd been functional, which is different, and he'd mistaken the difference for a long time. What the summer was instead, Miles talking to the bay mare in a low, continuous murmur that the horse visibly responded to, and Wade standing at the paddock fence watching this with a feeling he couldn't name but didn't need to. Josie appearing in the kitchen on a Saturday morning with a basket of tomatoes that were slightly irregular and genuinely excellent, and producing from them, with Eliza's assistance, a sauce that she served over pasta with the dignity of a person who has accomplished something real. Cooper in the barn asking questions about the cattle that had evolved from simple vocabulary questions to genuine inquiries about animal behavior, which Wade answered in full because the questions deserved full answers. Nora, who had maintained her careful reserve for months, began to let it soften in increments so small that it was only visible in retrospect. She started talking to Wade in longer stretches. She started finishing his sentences sometimes, in the way people do when they have built enough of a model of another person to predict where their thoughts are going. She showed him, in August, an essay she'd written for school about what she wanted to do when she grew up, something about structural engineering, which had clearly come from months of watching Eliza work, and she showed it to him specifically and not generally, which he understood was intentional and treated accordingly. It's good, he said. The part about load distribution is more accurate than most adults get it. I read your father's construction notes, she said. The ones in the barn. He looked at her. Those are in pretty rough shape. I could read most of it, she said. He had good handwriting. A pause. He thought about things carefully. You can tell from how he wrote. Wade was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. He did. Nora nodded, with the satisfied air of a hypothesis confirmed, and went back inside. He stood in the doorway of the barn for a while after that, and it was not a sad feeling, though it had some sadness in it. It was more like the feeling of a thing being passed on, not dramatically or ceremoniously, but in the ordinary way that things pass on, through proximity and attention and the quiet business of one person paying close enough attention to another person's life that something carries over. His father's handwriting in a child's memory. The careful thoughts of a man who had built things well, being read by a girl who was going to build things well someday. That felt like something worth noting. The formal decision about the children came in October, almost exactly a year after Eliza had first pulled into the yard in her shuddering truck and stood at the paddock fence and said, "I'm here about the cabin work," with those careful, watchful eyes. They had talked about it over the summer, not always directly, but in the way couples talk about things that matter when they are still learning how to talk to each other, in pieces and approximations and occasional full conversations that clarified more than had been said. Wade had raised the subject of legal guardianship first, carefully, as a practical matter, and Eliza had listened and said she needed to think about it, and she had thought about it, and then she had raised it again herself with specific questions that suggested she had been thinking about it in considerable detail. What they decided on was adoption, which was Wade's preference stated plainly, and Eliza's agreement given after the kind of careful, unhurried consideration that she gave to anything structural. They told the children on a Sunday evening after dinner, and the responses were precisely the children. Cooper asked if that meant Wade was his dad now, and was told yes, and said okay, and asked if they could get a dog, which had been his consistent negotiating position for months, and which he had apparently decided could now be formally reopened. Miles said nothing for a long moment and then said, quietly and with great sincerity, "Good," which was the most straightforward expression of feeling he had offered on any subject in Wade's experience of him. Josie climbed into Eliza's lap, which she had not done in front of anyone before, and stayed there for a long time without saying anything. Nora looked at Wade across the table. "You know it's not going to be easy," she said. "We're a lot." "I know you are," he said. "Miles talks more than he thinks he does. I've noticed. Cooper is going to keep asking about the dog until you say yes. I've noticed that too." She considered him for a moment. "Okay," she said. Then she got up and started clearing the dishes, because she was Nora, and Nora expressed herself through action more reliably than through words, and clearing the dishes was what she had. He let her clear the dishes. Eliza, behind her daughter's back, looked at him across the table, and the look she gave him had in it everything that was too large to say and didn't need to be said because it was there in her face plainly enough. The road from the line camp shack to this kitchen, the 18 months, and the fear and the courts, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from holding a family together alone, and the particular kind of thing it was to not be alone anymore. He looked back at her and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The dog arrived in November, which was Cooper's doing, and also, if Wade was honest with himself, an inevitability that had been biding its time for about 11 months. She was a 3-year-old border collie mix from the county shelter, a medium-sized black and white animal with intelligent eyes and the barely contained energy of a creature designed for a working landscape. And she arrived in the bed of Wade's truck one afternoon while the children were at school, and she investigated every corner of the ranch with professional thoroughness before deciding, apparently, that it met her standards. When the children got home and found the dog, the response was everything Cooper had advertised and more. The dog was named, after considerable democratic process, Birch, a compromise between Cooper's preferred name, which was something unrepeatable, and Nora's, which was a variety of grass she had read about in Wade's field guide. Birch accepted her name and her family with the equanimity of a dog who has spent time in a shelter and understands better than most creatures the specific value of a good situation. She slept, from the first night, at the foot of Cooper's bed. Well, there's a thing that happens to people who have been through the kind of sustained fear and hardship that Eliza Hart had been through. A thing that doesn't get talked about much in the stories about survival, which tend to end at the point where the danger stops. The thing is that the body and the mind, which have been running at crisis pitch for months or years, don't simply stop when the crisis stops. They keep their vigilance for a while. They still flinch at sounds. They still scan doorways. They still wake at odd hours and listen. The calibration takes time to reset, and some of it never entirely does. Wade understood this without being told. He had watched Eliza for a year, and he understood that some of her habits of caution were going to be permanent features of who she was, not wounds to be healed, but the shape that a person takes when they have survived something real. He did not try to fix this. He adjusted to it the way people who care about each other adjust to the specific contours of the other person. Not to a version they've decided would be better, but to the actual person in front of them. She still checked the locks twice. She still, sometimes, tracked the sound of an engine on the highway before she let herself relax back into what she'd been doing. There were nights when he could hear her moving through the house in the small hours, not because anything was wrong, but because her body still believed, on some level, that she needed to check. On one of those nights, he came downstairs and found her at the kitchen table with tea, and he sat down and made himself coffee, and they sat together in the dark kitchen without talking for a long while. And outside the window, the Colorado night was deep, and the stars were very clear, and the ranch was very quiet in the good way, the way it had gotten over the course of a year of being less empty. "Do you think it goes away?" she asked, not specifying. "I don't know," he said. "I think it changes. I think you build enough good time over it that it gets smaller." "But it's always there." "Maybe," he said. "I think maybe you get to a point where it's just part of the architecture. It's not the whole building anymore." She held her cup in both hands and looked at the window. "I feel different than I used to," she said. "Before him, I mean. I don't know if that's permanent or not." "You're different because you've been through different things," he said. "That's not damage. That's what living does." She looked at him across the table. "That's a very forgiving way to look at it." "I'm not forgiving anything," he said. "I'm just describing what I see. The woman who drove into this yard a year ago had been through things that would have broken a lot of people entirely, and she had 4 kids in a line camp shack and a truck that was one freeze away from dying on a mountain road, and she wasn't broken. She was tired, and she was scared, and she was carrying about 3 times what any one person should carry, but she wasn't broken." "Eat down." He paused. "I don't see how that changes who you are into something lesser. It seems like the opposite." She looked at him for a long time in the kitchen dark. "You're a good man," she said. Not with surprise, not as a compliment exactly, but as a statement of something she had arrived at through evidence and considered reliable. The same way she would have said the east wall was structurally sound, after checking, after testing, after being willing to find otherwise and not finding it. "I'm working on it," he said. "Aren't we all?" she said, and picked up her tea. The house was quiet around them. Upstairs, 4 children were sleeping in rooms that were their own, in a house that was their own, on land that had their history in it now alongside everyone else's history, and the border collie was at the foot of a small boy's bed. And outside the window, the running sea was the same piece of ground it had always been, indifferent and solid and large enough to hold whatever was built on it, what had been built on it, over the course of a year and a season of fear, and a tree through a cabin roof, and a line camp shack, and a courtroom in a county building, and a yard fight in March mud, and 100 ordinary breakfasts, and the bay mare's nose on a boy's shoulder, and a girl's rock collection on a windowsill. What had been built was not perfect. It was the work of imperfect people doing imperfect things with what they had. There were things that would take years more to settle, histories that would surface at inconvenient times. A man who was somewhere in the state serving out conditions that would eventually expire. Children who would carry their early years into adulthood in ways that couldn't entirely be predicted or prepared for. But it was real, and it was standing, and it had been built on something true, not on a story anyone had decided to believe, but on the actual substance of who people were when they stopped pretending and stopped running and let themselves be seen. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only foundation worth building anything on. Wade finished his coffee. Eliza finished her tea. They sat in the quiet kitchen for a while longer, not because there was anything more to say, but because there was nowhere else either of them wanted to be. Outside, the Colorado dark held everything it always held. The mountains and the pastures and the fences and the cattle moving slowly in the cold, and the road coming in from the highway that a rusted truck had driven down one morning a year ago when the world was smaller and harder and the people in this kitchen didn't know each other yet. The road was still there. Everything else had changed.